this is what I played for him.
Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Hello and welcome to Cuckoo Town. My name's Mark. We will be returning to the topic of our first episode, Aleister Crowley and the Tregarthen Horror, at a later date, when we'll have the well-known artist and researcher Bob Osborne on as our guest. But for today's episode, we're going to be looking at something completely different, ghosts of the railways. But first, I'm going to make a little confession to you. I love trains. There, I've said it out loud now. Yes, I caught the train bug from my dad, Robert E. Wyatt, Bob, or Lofty to his mates. He was a fireman on the English Southern Railways steam engines in the 1950s and early 60s. He only left that job to earn more money elsewhere due to his growing family, myself included. But Dad never ever lost his passion for anything railway related. He even listened to steam engines and diesels on vinyl. He could tell all the trains apart with ease, as they all had such unique sounds. It was all music to my dad's ears. He often intimated that steam engines had their own life force, a soul even, that they were living, breathing machines. Now, there will be some rational materialist types out there listening who would scoff at that notion, but I certainly don't. You see, there's something about trains. They have a tendency to haunt the rails that they once ran on, even when those rails went out of service many years earlier, or are no longer there. Even when the welders at metal scrapyards have cut them into tiny pieces, they are still occasionally seen, as they were in their heyday. Perhaps the architect of our universe, let's call him the signalman, occasionally messes up by pulling the wrong levers, inadvertently running one timeline into another. And some of us are lucky enough, or maybe in some cases unlucky enough, to see the resultant glitches. And do we leave a residue of our emotions on rail tracks or at the station? For example, a suicide might leave the fear that they were experiencing shortly before they threw themselves in front of the 803 from Guildford to London, for example, and lovers saying farewell on a station, suspecting it could be for the last time. Do they leave their combined sadness? And it could work in reverse too. A happy event, say happy reunion perhaps, could leave something of those happy feelings. Anyway, I probably rattled on for far too long, just like some rickety old train carriage that's way past its prime. So I'll leave you now to your own thoughts. I hope you enjoy these railway ghost stories. Here's a little story to get us started. I was being nosy, really, browsing online on an online forum for train drivers. This was 5-6 years ago. And one of these drivers was telling the story because they'd sort of got onto the subject of ghosts on the railways. And one of the drivers told this story that he'd been on the old London Midland Scottish route. So he's somewhere in the Midlands of England. And it's the middle of the night. And he's going through this really, really long tunnel when all of a sudden there's a big bump and it doesn't derail him, but it's like really uncomfortable. And he wonders, he's had this sort of thing happen before. He thinks he might have hit a fox, or at worst it could be a person, because sometimes get sort of homeless people just wandering, And of course he was very concerned. It might have been a piece of wood or a piece of some kids might have been in there and left a brick on the line or something. So he goes in there with his powerful torch on his own, and he leaves his driver's mate to sort of like with the engine, and he very slowly walks into this huge long tunnel in pitch black. Can't really see in front of him except for he's got a powerful torch, and he's following the railway line along. And he suddenly, in sort of halfway through, he notices that the track, where the track is joined, where there was a join, but it sort of sticks up slightly and it's obviously not good. So he bends down to have a look at this, because he's got to report this and get it repaired like super quick before another train comes through. So as he's looking down and he's inspecting the damage to see what's happened, somebody taps him on the shoulder in this pitch black tunnel where he's alone. And it's very distinctive. He knows that someone's just tapped him on the shoulder. And he sort of fearfully looks round because he doesn't know what to expect. And as he's looking around, there's a voice and it says, "Got a light, mate?" Nobody there, of course. And he was telling his mates on the forum, he said, "I've never run so f***ing fast in my life." This story is called Second Sight. It's from A Stranger in the Fog and Other Chilling Tales from the Tracks by Barry Herbert. I'm indebted to Mr. M. Hooton of Bolton for a very strange mystery from his boyhood, for which to this day there would appear to be no explanation. One can only think that he somehow became involved in a kind of time warp that was to continue to bewilder him some 30 years later. It happened when he was 13. When he was very keen on train spotting. He would, like many boys of his time, go anywhere to get engine numbers. He was an expert on the different types of steam engines, where they came from, who built them, where they were going, all this sort of stuff. The incident took place in 1950. It was a Sunday night in August. The location was Northenden Junction. On this particular Sunday, as on most Sundays, the signal box at Northenden Junction was switched out and the signals left clear for the main line to and from Tiviot Dale. Now, it goes on with a lot of technical detail here, which I'm going to sort of cut out. So we just go. As I was aware that excursions to and from the Lancashire coast very often passed through Northenden on a Sunday, I cycled along there to see whether there would be any action for me. What he means by that is any steam engines coming through that he could take a note of the numbers. I positioned myself on a road bridge adjacent to Northenden Junction's signal box. It was a very clear summer evening. Visibility was excellent and there was full light. I waited on that bridge for about an hour, and although I was very patient, I then began to get a bit fidgety. I really wanted to see some action. Besides, I had to be home soon as I had a paper round to do early the next morning. No one was about. I looked up and down the railway line. There was nothing in sight. I was just about to pack up and go home when I suddenly saw the smoke of a train approaching from the direction of Skelton Junction. I positioned myself on the bridge parapet, safely of course, to get a good look at the engine and the length of the train. When it came into view, the engine was a Stanier Class 5, what we used to call a Black 5. It was hauling a train of 5 coaches, and when it reached my position I noted the steam engine's number on the smoke box door. It was 44813. It was travelling at a leisurely pace, probably between 40 and 45 miles an hour. I paid no more attention to it as it passed under the bridge, but I did record the number in the pocketbook that I always carried with me. I looked up and down the line to see if anything else was in sight, and I noticed to my surprise another plume of smoke coming from the same direction as the previous train. I quickly looked to see if I could see the last train, but of course it had gone by now. I couldn't believe that 2 trains could follow each other so closely in so long a section, but it was another train all right, and I was interested to see if it was another passenger working, another passenger train. Although at my tender age I did not understand the complexities of railway signalling, something told me that all was not as it should be. But by now the train was getting nearer and I was really keen on taking the number of the loco coming towards me. I remained in my position on the bridge, and as the train approached I saw that it was again a Black 5, and again it was hauling 5 carriages, just like the last one. Now for the number. I peered down at the smoke box number plate. To my surprise it said 44813. This puzzled me. The train was again running at a leisurely 40 to 45 miles an hour, just like the last one. I thought, how strange. I opened up my pocketbook, and there on the page was the number I'd just jotted down earlier, 44813. I couldn't believe it. It would appear that I'd been caught up in something really strange at that time. although the thought of a time warp at that point didn't enter my mind. Years later I did wonder about the possibility of a time warp, but even then I wasn't sure what one of these things even was. The possibility of a mistake on my part never entered my mind. At 13, train spotting was a very serious business. We were so eagle-eyed, all of us. But mistakes, they just didn't happen. Over the years, I thought from time to time about those mysterious happenings, and the memory is still very clear in my mind. Although I've been over and over and over it in my mind, the circumstances remain unsolved. This is the second of my short stories from A Stranger in the Fog by Barry Herbert. This one's called The Man in the Black Beret. This story concerns a young man who witnessed the replay of a past accident, seeing in graphic detail the appalling event. Andy had just left school, and at the time of the incident, the 1960s, he was able to find a job with British Railways as an apprentice signalman. However, his first duties saw him engaged in the removal of redundant signalling equipment as part of the updating and modernisation of post-war British Railways. Andy was working with two mates, Alf and Ron, who were older and much more experienced. They were able to instruct Andy in the initial part of his training. This particular day was quite bright for December, and the three men enjoyed the 10-mile journey to the location where they had to dismantle the redundant signal cabin. The senior man, Alf, instructed Andy to remove the levers from the frame and load them into the BR van, British Railways. At about 3 p.m, Alf asked Andy if he would walk to the nearby village and get them some cigarettes and chocolate, as the men wanted a break. So Andy set off along the deserted, rusting track, which was by now being covered by the spread of weeds and other undergrowth. Having made his purchases, he started to walk back along the old railway line, this time walking on the sleepers. To any Americans listening, a sleeper is, you call them ties. It was beginning to get dusk, and the clouds were hastening the end of a winter's day. He was about halfway back when he heard a noise that made his hair stand on end, the sound of a steam engine. Was it possible? He looked around, but there was nothing in sight. Then faintly, on the slight breeze, he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a steam engine, and it was approaching him. Andy knew that steam motive power had ceased in that area many years before. Anyway, the line had been closed to all rail traffic for months, so what was such an engine doing on the line now? He quickened his pace, knowing that something was wrong and wanting to get as far away from the place as possible. Panic set in when the sound of the engine became much louder. Then he stumbled on the sleepers and fell face down. The engine was now almost upon him. He turned to look, and an amazing sequence of events unfolded before his eyes. The whole area was bathed in a haze of yellow light that seemed somehow menacing. He tried to get to his feet, but for some reason he was unable to do so. He heard the blood-curdling shriek of the engine's whistle, its piercing notes splitting the December air. Then Andy saw the tall figure of a man dressed in railway uniform and wearing a black beret, like those that had been worn by the Royal Tank Corps, instead of the regulation railway hat. The figure stood in the track, seemingly rooted to the spot, and made no move to avoid the oncoming engine. Suddenly there was a horrible piercing scream from the figure. The engine struck it and ground it beneath its wheels. At last Andy found his feet, and he ran as fast as he could back to the other men. He leapt through the door of a box and collapsed on the floor. When Alf revived him with a cup of strong tea, he poured out his story. "Don't be daft," they scoffed. "I tell you I saw him killed," said Andy, "and he was wearing a black beret like the tank corps used to wear in the war." Alf stroked his chin. A black beret. Then the recollections came flooding back. Alf told Andy the story. "I remember now. It was about 9 or 10 years ago. There was a bloke killed doing track maintenance work around here somewhere. He wore a Blackberry. He was well known. They loaded the van and left, vowing never to return to that area again. Another gang finished the job. As far as is known, there has been no further sighting of the Phantom engine. This one's called The Train in the Night. It's also, of course, from A Stranger in the Fog by Barry Herbert. Mr. A. Dixon of West Bridgeford, near Nottingham, writes to tell me of a very strange occurrence that happened to him and his wife while they were living in West Dereham in 1954 to 55. Mr. Dixon worked at a local farm on the outskirts of the village. In those days, the station only had the benefit of a goods service, which I suspect only ran when demand warranted it. The farmers used it to convey their produce, and general goods were carried on other occasions. Anyway, one night Mr. Dixon woke up with a bit of a start. He could hear a noise. He leapt out of his bed and he peered out of a window. The Dixons' house commanded a view over the railway where it ran through the village. Mrs. Dixon, also waking with a noise, wanted to know what the excitement was all about, and she soon joined her husband at the window. They could both hear a train coming towards the village, the clear night amplifying the unmistakable sound of an approaching steam engine. They looked at each other, peered out of the window again, then they saw it, a steam engine pulling two carriages, passing slowly along the rusting line. As it slowly passed out of sight, the Dixons looked at each other in puzzlement again. Where would a passenger train be running to at around 3 a.m. in the morning? Who would be opening the gates at the level crossing? Still wondering about this, they tried to get back to sleep. The following day, Mr. Dixon mentioned the incident to his workmates on the farm. They looked at each other and grinned. One of them said, "You've been dreaming, mate. No passenger train has run down this line for many years." But the Dixons were adamant. They knew what they had seen.
Dark Notes Podcast. If you like music and horror, high strangeness, you should listen.
This is my fourth and final story from A Stranger in the Fog by Barry Herbert. This one's called The Phantom Western. Mr. Heathcliff, when he was a young lad, was a train spotter. He used to go and stand on stations and sit on bridges and embankments and take notes of numbers of trains and so on. This one was because he was a young man in the sort of early 70s. He was more into like the diesels, because by this time the steam engines had mostly gone, except for in their preserved lines. And he was particularly fascinated with these particular range of diesel engine called the Westerns. And I actually know about these myself because I used to love them too. They have a particular sound, just like a rumbling, an absolute rumbling. So Mr. Heathcliff, he went with his father to Newbury horse races on a cold but sunny day in mid-May 1974. Mr. Heathcliff Jr. did not particularly like horses, but the racecourse at Newbury was situated very near the main railway line to the west of England, so he thought he would see something interesting during the day. However, during the first hour of watching this line, only Class 47 locomotives were running on the line, and he wasn't particularly interested in that particular class of engine. But eventually the unmistakable sound and shape of a Western came into view. He could clearly see the number and the name. It was D1041, Western Prince, and it was pulling some well-filled passenger coaches. It was doing about 80 miles an hour. Following the train down, he saw the blue sky darken, and he heard again the familiar Maybach music. Now, Maybach was the engine which created this very distinctive rumbling sound. So there was another Western approaching. From round the curve it came, highly polished and singing sweetly as only a well-maintained machine can. As she drew level with him, he could read very clearly the name and number, It was Western Princess D1042. His favourite engine had supposedly been reprieved and repaired. This was not unknown on British railways. Withdrawn locomotives were sometimes taken out of store, overhauled and put back into service. However, a few days later, a friend in Swindon Works, this is like a big railway maintenance place, he said, "I've got some bad news for you. We cut up your old friend, the Princess, on the 18th. "Oh, no, you didn't," said young Mr. Heathcliff. "I saw her on an up express at Newbury just the other day." His friend persisted, but it was not until Mr. Heathcliff saw it in print that he actually believed that the Western Princess was no more. So what did he see at Newbury on the 18th of May 1974? He repeats that, as a railwayman, he knew what the locomotive looked like. The shape and sound of a Maybach-engined Western is unique, and the only other Western it could have been was the Western Prince, and that had been seen moments before going in the other direction. Could he have witnessed the final fling of Western Princess on the day that she died, in inverted commas, at Swindon Works? A similar experience was witnessed by a colleague one Saturday night in South Devon. He was heading east on an express train between Plymouth and Totnes when it was stopped by engineering work. The locomotive on the engineer's train was D1067, Western Druid. Records show that this locomotive was cut up on the 16th of September 1976, yet the sighting in question was February 1977. So what can we deduce from these experiences? Mr. Heathcliff is adamant that his story is factual and completely without any fabrication.
You've been listening to Cuckoo Town, a Leviathan Media production. Copyright Mark Anthony Wyatt, 2022. The Cuckoo song, written by Michael Pretorius over 400 years ago, was performed by Mark, with a brief intro from Clarence Ashley. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, share, save us to your favorites, and all that good stuff. Oh, and please don't forget to tell your friends about Cuckoo Town. Find us on all major podcast platforms.
We'll see you next time when we'll be taking another stroll down a road less travelled. Oh, just one more thing before you go. Be lucky! Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack-a-dammons, jack-a-dammons. This episode is dedicated to the memory of my dad, Robert E. Wyatt, also known as Lofty and Bob, 1933 to 2012. I hope you enjoyed it, Dad. Cheers, mate.